Hi, I'm Gareth Green, and in this video we're going to be considering which might be the best chords to follow chord 7 in a major key. Now, it's an interesting topic because many textbooks will advise you to avoid chord 7 wherever possible because chord 7 is a little bit tricky. However, there are good uses that can be made of chord 7, so I want to mount a campaign in support of chord 7 through this video. And just before we get going, let's be entirely sure what we mean by the Roman numeral system. We're going to work in C major, it's the easiest key, so the scale of C, C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C. We can put chords on each of those notes of the scale by having the root note of the scale followed by a third above it and a fifth above it. So chord 1 is C, E, G, chord 2 is D, F, A, chord 3 is E, G, B, chord 4 is F, A, C, chord 5 is G, B, D, chord 6 is A, C, E, chord 7 is B, D, F, and that's the one we're talking about today, that chord 7. Also within the scale, of course, chord 1 is major, chord 2 is minor, chord 3 is minor, chord 4 is major, chord 5 is major, chord 6 is minor, but chord 7 is diminished. It's the only diminished chord inside the major scale. And that's why it causes this little bit of controversy, because dealing with diminished chords needs slightly careful handling. So we'll be covering that in this video. So the Roman numerals are those chord numbers, because we always talk about chords in terms of Roman numerals, unless we're describing them as C or DM or something. So we know that if we see Roman numerals, we're talking about chords. And in case you're wondering what this B is after some of the chords on the board, that's telling us that the chord is in first inversion. Two systems for talking about inversions, and one is ABC. Simple as that. So if a chord is in root position, so in other words, we're looking at chord 7 today. So there's chord 7 and the bottom of that chord is B. So if B is the lowest note of the chord, we say it's in root position, so we call that A. If the middle note of the chord is actually the bottom note of the chord, so we put D in the bottom, we say it's in first inversion, so we call it B. 7B in this case. If the fifth note, the top of that chord, is actually at the bottom, so that F is the lowest sounding note, then we say it's in second inversion and it's C. So A for root position, B for first inversion, C for second inversion. If you've been brought up on a different convention, it's likely to be this, that you would have chord 7 and then you would call it 5-3 for root position, and then if it's in first inversion, you'd call it 6-3, and if it's in second inversion, you call it 6-4. And that's normally abbreviated, so if it's root position 7 with a 5-3, you just don't bother with a 5-3. If it's blank, you assume it's 5-3. If it's in first inversion and it's 6-3, we normally abbreviate that to 6. So 6 is just an abbreviation for 6-3. And if it's in second inversion and it's 6-4, then you would write the 6-4 in full. So I'm using the ABC method because it's just dead straightforward. But if you're being brought up on a different system, treat the B as a 6 and it will make total sense to you. Now then, let's talk about why I've given you 5 possible progressions from chord 7, but all of them are going from 7B or 7-6. In other words, chord 7 in first inversion. Because chord 7 is a diminished chord, when we have it in root position, you have this tritone between the bottom and the top, or a diminished fifth between B and F, and that's generally speaking a slightly awkward interval. Now, if I put that B in the bass, it just kind of makes that even more obvious, that tritone between the bottom and the top of the chord. And some people take the view that it makes the chord sound a bit ugly. But Well, it may be that you want a particular effect and it works really well in root position. So even though some textbooks say never use it in root position, I'm not saying that. I mean, if it works for you in root position because you're after a particular effect, go for it. However, if you do put it in first inversion, it sort of mitigates that tritone because the tritone gets hidden within the chord rather than being the thing that you hear between the top and the bottom. So if you hide it in the middle, it has sort of less of an impact. So if I reorganize that chord in first inversion, many people would say that sounds less ugly than having it in root position. And in fact, it sounds quite pleasant when you've got it in first inversion. Can we use it in second inversion? Well, yes, you can. Some composers certainly do. But the most common position for it is going to be in first inversion. So rather than kind of following the advice offered by some to avoid chord 7 like the plague, what I would do is to say, well, if you're going to use chord 7, the safest way of using it is to use it in first inversion. Certainly until you get more confident with it. So we're going to treat all these progressions in first inversion. Now, I've come up with 5 possibilities, and then I'm going to talk about something called the replacement passing 6/4. So if we've got this 7B or this 7/6 chord, it has a natural pull onto chord 1. And this is all about something we call voice leading. So in other words, when you hear a chord or you hear a particular note in a chord, where does it naturally want to go? So let's take this 7B in option 1. That B, wherever it is pulling you up to C. The D in the bass is pulling you down to C. And the F in the middle is pulling you down to E. So there's a very natural flow from 7B onto chord 1, simply because the voice leading is kind of naturally pulling you that way. Not the only possibility by far, but it's one of the strongest options to go from 7 in first inversion onto a chord 1. However, option 2 gives us the option to go from the same chord onto chord 1, but chord 1 in first inversion. So you might do this. That also sounds okay, doesn't it? Particularly if you're going on a bit further. So what am I doing this time? That B is still going up to C. The F, even though you might feel it wants to go down to E, also can pull up to G. And the D in the bass that sort of pulls down to C also pulls up to E. So, perfectly possible to go from your chord 7 in first inversion on to chord 1 in first inversion if you don't want to go on to a root position chord. So, you know, lots of options that would flow from that. If you had a 7B going to 1B, you could go to 4 to 5, or a 7B to a 1B to 4 to 5 to 1. Flows on perfectly well, doesn't it? So those are kind of some of the safest places to use it, following it with 1 or 1B. Let's have a look at option 3, which in many ways is less obvious, to go from 7B onto chord 3. Now, after 7, 3 is kind of the weakest chord in the hierarchy of chords, if you like. It's the next chord that's least likely to be used. So to kind of go from the least likely chord to the next least likely chord seems a slightly curious thing to do at one level. But how does it work? Well, if I've got a 7B and I'm going to a 3, actually it sounds quite nice. So there's your 7B going to a 3. Now you might think, well, where am I going to go from there? Well, 7B to a 3 might go to a 4. And the nice thing about that is the bass climbs. D, E, F. So that's kind of quite a nice progression, isn't it? 7B to a 3 to a 4. Could go on to a 5 and then a 6 even. So you could just have the bass climbing. Or 7B to a 3 to a 4 to a 5 to a 1. So That's a kind of less common progression, but actually I think it's quite a good one. Okay, let's look at another option, which is option 4, when you take a 7b onto 5. Okay, well here's 7b, and we can go on to 5. Sounds all right, doesn't it? 7b, 5, 1. So that's all right. You could do that, however. That's just another possibility. You could make that 5 into a 5, 7. And let me just explain why that might be a good option. There's absolutely nothing wrong with going from 7b to 5, and then maybe on to 1, or 7b to 5 to 6. But 7b onto 5, 7 is particularly good in the sense that it has a lot of notes in common. And this is always an interesting thing about chord 7. When you look at chord 7, you've got B, D, F in the chord, but as soon as you put G underneath it, you've got a dominant 7th chord, a chord 5, 7. So do you see that these 3 notes of chord 7, when you just add this third below the chord, becomes a 5, 7. So, you know, the difference between chord 7 and 5, 7 is not actually that great. There's just 1 note, but you've got 3 notes in common. So sometimes a 7b is a handy replacement for a 5, 7, or vice versa. So there's a bit of an interchange here. So I might go 7b, and then I might go 5, 7, and then 1. So 7b, 5, 7, 6. There's another possibility. So you see how that is actually also quite a handy progression. Okay, let's look at option 5, in which we're going from 7b to chord 6. So let's consider what this is about. Chord 7b going on to 6. Now, that's also quite a nice progression. Now, partly, again, voice leading. You see what's happening here? B is going up to C. F is going down to E. So even though the bass is leaping, the other 2 parts are going nicely by step and kind of in contramotion with each other. So that's quite a nice progression as well. So I'm going to suggest that these 5 possibilities are all very real ones. So consider those. We always kind of shy away from chord 7 for the reasons that I've spoken about. But actually, it's perhaps a more versatile chord than most people realise. Now, before we leave it, let's talk about this, a passing 6/4. What on earth is that about? Well, you have a progression that can do this. You can go chord 1, chord 5 in 2nd inversion, followed by chord 1 in 1st inversion. So 1, 5 in 2nd inversion, 1 in 1st inversion. Or you can go the other way. 1 in 1st inversion, 5 in 2nd inversion, 1 in root position. And that 5 in 2nd inversion that sandwiches between 1 and 1 in 1st inversion, that 5 in 2nd inversion, is a 6/4. So in that system where we talked about 2nd inversion chords being 6/4 chords, otherwise you know it as a C chord, well, it's passing between chord 1 and chord 1 in 1st inversion. Whichever way it goes, whichever way it passes, it's passing between. So this chord 5 in 2nd inversion is a passing 6/4 between 1 and 1 in 1st inversion. However, you can replace that 5 in 2nd inversion with a 7 in 1st inversion. So in other words, we go 1, 7 in 1st inversion, 1B, or the other way around. 1B, so 1 in 1st inversion, 7 in 1st inversion, 1. And arguably, using 7 in 1st inversion makes for a slightly stronger chord than using 5 in 2nd inversion. So it's a possible replacement for a passing 6/4. So that's using chord 7 in 1st inversion between chord 1 and chord 1 in 1st inversion. So I hope I've convinced you in this video that actually chord 7 has got much more potential than we realize. So that's ideas on how to use chord 7 when you're working in a major key. Well, I hope you found this video helpful, and if you have, you might want to go to our website www.mmcourses.co.uk, where you can find details of all of our online courses covering theory, harmony, oral work, analysis, orchestration, a whole host of other things, and that would enable you to go much deeper than this. We've got lots of videos on the YouTube channel. They're all one-offs. The courses are kind of A to Z progression. So if you really want to get to grips with all of this stuff, that's the way to go. So you might want to have a look at the courses we have on offer there. And while you're on the homepage, you might just want to click on Maestros. There's a link there that takes you to the details of a very exciting Maestros program. And if you want to sign up to Maestros, there are kind of fun things, emojis, badges, behind the scenes material, all that kind of stuff. But you also get discounts on the courses, and you have access to our monthly live stream. So 2 live streams a month. And one of those is a kind of hour of solid teaching input, really, where we try to learn about a composer, we try to do some analysis, maybe do some composition, some harmony, a whole variety of things there. And there's a live chat running through it, so you can ask any question you want to ask, pass any comment on anything we're doing. And then we have a second live stream, which is absolutely for you to submit your compositions or recordings of your own performances, harmony exercises, anything that you would like personal feedback on. And I will give you that one-to-one feedback, but we just share that as a group so we can all learn from each other. Wonderful group of people on the live streams as part of our Music Matters Maestros international community. Lots of mutual support, lots of people telling us that they're kind of on this slightly lonely trail, and it's wonderful to get together with other folk in the same position once a month, and that they learn so much from it and from each other. And benefit from the support from each other as well. So if that's something that interests you, well, there it is at Maestros. But have a look on the website, there's lots of other stuff there as well.